Chapter 7, Part 2 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 7, Part 2. Beginning of a New Period of Conquest. In the spring of 1576, Salcedo died at Bigan, at the age of 27. With his death may be said to close the first period of the history in the Philippines, that of the conquest, extending from 1565 to 1576. For the next 25 years the ambitions of the Spaniards were not content with the exploration of this archipelago, but there were greater and more striking conquests, to which the minds of both soldier and priest aspired. Despite the settlement with Portugal, the rich Spice Islands to the south still attracted them, and there were soon revealed the fertile coasts of Siam and Cambodia, the great empire of China, the beautiful island of Formosa, and the Japanese archipelago. These, with their great populations and wealth, were more alluring fields than the poor and sparsely populated coasts of the Philippines. So, for the next quarter of a century, the policy of the Spaniards in the Philippines was not so much to develop these islands themselves as to make them a center for the commercial and spiritual conquest of the Orient. A treaty with the Chinese. The new governor arrived in the islands in August, 1575. He was Dr. Francisco de Sande. In October there returned the ambassadors who had been sent to China by Labezares. The viceroy of Fukien had received them with much ceremony. He had not permitted the friars to remain, but had forwarded the governor's letter to the Chinese emperor. In February following came a Chinese embassy, granting a port of the empire with which the Spaniards could trade. This port probably was Amoy, which continued to be the chief port of communication with China to the present day. It was undoubtedly commerce and not the missionaries that the Chinese desired. 2 Augustinians attempted to return with this embassy to China, but the Chinese, on leaving the harbor of Manila, landed on the coast of Zambales, where they whipped the missionaries, killed their servants and interpreter, and left the friars bound to trees, whence they were rescued by a small party of Spaniards who happened to pass that way. Sir Francis Drake's noted voyage. The year 1577 is notable for the appearance in the East of the great English sea captain, freebooter, and naval hero Francis Drake. England and Spain, at this moment, while not actually at war, were rapidly approaching the conflict which made them for centuries traditional enemies. Spain was the champion of Roman ecclesiasticism. Her king, Philip II, was not only a cruel bigot, but a politician of sweeping ambition. His schemes included the conquest of France and England, the extermination of Protestantism, and the subjection of Europe to his own and the Roman authority. The English people scented the danger from afar, and while the two courts nominally maintained peace, the daring seamen of British Devon were quietly putting to sea in their swift and terrible vessels for the crippling of the Spanish power. The history of naval warfare records no more reckless adventures than those of the English mariners during this period. Audacity could not rise higher. Drake's is the most famous and romantic figure of them all. In the year 1577 he sailed from England with the avowed purpose of sweeping the Spanish Main. He passed the Straits of Magellan and came up the western coast of South America, despoiling the Spanish shipping from Valparaiso to Panama. Thence he came on across the Pacific, touched the coast of Mindanao, and turned south to the Moluccas. The Portuguese had nominally annexed the Moluccas in 1522, but at the time of Drake's visit they had been driven from Ternate, though still holding Tidor. Drake entered into friendly relations with the Sultan of Ternate, and secured a cargo of cloves. From here he sailed boldly homeward, daring the Portuguese fleets, as he had defied the Spanish, and by way of Good Hope returned to England, his ship the first after Magellan's to circumnavigate the globe. A Spanish expedition to Borneo. The appearance of Drake in the Moluccas roused Sande to ambitious action. The attraction of the southern archipelagos was overpowering, and at this moment the opportunity seemed to open to the governor to force southward his power. One of the Malay kings of Borneo, Sirela, arrived in Manila, petitioning aid against his brother and promising to acknowledge the sovereignty of the King of Spain over the kingdom of Borneo. Sande went in person to restore this chieftain to power. He had a fleet of galleys and frigates, and according to Padre Gaspar de San Agustin, more than 1,500 Filipino bowmen from Pangasinan, Cagayan, and the Bisayas accompanied the expedition. He landed on the coast of Borneo, destroyed the fleet of Perez and the city of the usurper, and endeavored to secure Circla in his principality. Sickness among his fleet and the lack of provisions forced him to return to Manila. The first attack upon the Moros of Jolo. On his return he sent an officer against the island of Jolo. This officer forced the Joloanos to recognize his power, and from there he passed to the island of Mindanao, where he further enforced obedience upon the natives. This was the beginning of the Spanish expeditions against the Moros, and it had the effect of arousing in these Mohammedan pirates terrible retaliatory vengeance. Under Sande, the conquest of the Camarines was completed by Captain Juan Chavos, and the city of Nueva Caceres was founded. The appointment of Governor Ronquillo. It was the uniform policy of the Spanish government to limit the term of office of the governor to a short period of years. This was one of the feudal provisions by which Spain attempted to control both the ambition and the avarice of her colonial captains. But Don Gonzalo Ronquillo had granted to him the governorship of the Philippines for life, on the condition of his raising and equipping a force of 600 Spaniards, largely at his own expense, for the better protection and pacification of the archipelago. This Ronquillo did, bringing his expedition by way of Panama. He arrived in April, 1580, and although he died at the end of 3 years, his rule came at an important time. The Spanish and the Portuguese colonies combined. In 1580, Philip II conquered and annexed to Spain the kingdom of Portugal, and with Portugal came necessarily to the Spanish crown those rich eastern colonies which the valor of da Gama and Albuquerque had won. Portugal re-won her independence in 1640, but for years Manila was the center of a colonial empire extending from Goa in India to Formosa. Events of Ronquillo's rule. Ronquillo, under orders from the crown, entered into correspondence with the captain of the Portuguese fortress on the island of Tidor, and the captain of Tidor petitioned Ronquillo for assistance in reconquering the tempting island of Ternate. Ronquillo sent south a considerable expedition, but after arriving in the Moluccas, the disease of beriberi in the Spanish camp defeated the undertaking. Ronquillo also sent a small armada to the coasts of Borneo and Malacca, where a limited amount of pepper was obtained. The few years of Ronquillo's reign were in other ways important. A colony of Spaniards was established at Oton, on the island of Panay, near the site of the present city of Iloilo. And under Ronquillo was pacified for the first time the great valley of the Cagayan. At the mouth of the river a Japanese adventurer, Tefusa, or Tezufu, had established himself and was attempting the subjugation of this important part of northern Luzon. Ronquillo sent against him Captain Carreon, who expelled the intruder and established on the present site of Laloc the city of Nueva Segovia. 2 friars accompanied this expedition, and the occupation of this valley by the Spaniards was made permanent. The first conflicts between the Church and the State. In March, 1581, there arrived the first bishop of Manila, Domingo de Salazar. Almost immediately began those conflicts between the spiritual and civil authorities, and between bishop and the regular orders, which have filled to no small degree the history of the islands. The bishop was one of those authoritative, ambitious, and arrogant characters, so typical in the history of the Church. It was largely due to his protests against the autocratic power of the governor that the king was induced to appoint the first audiencia. The character and power of these courts have already been explained. The president and judges arrived the year following the death of Ronquillo, and the president, Dr. Santiago de Vera, became acting governor during the succeeding 5 years. In 1587, the first Dominicans, 15 in number, arrived, and founded their celebrated mission, La Provincia del Santissimo Rosario. La Provincia del Santissimo Rosario. Increasing strength of the Malays. De Vera continued the policy of his predecessors, and another fruitless attack was made on Ternate in 1585. The power of the Malay people was increasing, while that of the Europeans was decreasing. The sultans had expelled their foreign masters, and neither Spaniard nor Portuguese were able to effect the conquest of the Moluccas. There were uprisings of the natives in Manila and in Cagayan and Ilocos. The Decree of 1589. Affairs in the islands did not yet, however, suit Bishop Salazar, and as the representative of both governor and bishop, the Jesuit Alonso Sanchez was dispatched in 1586 to lay the needs of the colony before the king. Philip was apparently impressed with the necessity of putting the government of the islands upon a better administrative basis. To this end, he published the important decree of 1589. The governor now became a paid officer of the crown, at a salary of 10,000 ducats. For the proper protection of the colony and the conquest of the Moluccas, a regular force of 400 soldiers accompanied the governor. His powers were extended to those of an actual viceregent of the king, and the audiencia was abolished. The man selected to occupy this important post was Don Gomez Perez Dasmarinas, who arrived with the new constitution in May 1590. So great was the chagrin of the bishop at the abolition of the audiencia and the increase of the governor's power that he himself set out for Spain to lay his wishes before the court. The missionary efforts of the friars. 24 Franciscans came with Dasmarinas, and the presence now of 3 orders necessitated the partition of the islands among them. The keenest rivalry and jealousy existed among them over the prosecution of missions in still more foreign lands. To the missionaries of this age it seemed a possible thing to convert the great and conservative nations of China and Japan to the Western religion. In the month of Dasmarinas' arrival, a company of Dominicans attempted to found a mission in China, and, an embassy coming from Japan to demand vassalage from the Philippines, 4 of the newly arrived Franciscans accompanied the Japanese on their return. A year later, in 1592, another embassy from the King of Cambodia arrived, bringing gifts that included 2 elephants and petitioning for succor against the King of Siam. This was the beginning of an alliance between Cambodia and the Philippines which lasted for many years and which occasioned frequent military aid and many efforts to convert that country. Death of Dasmarinas. But the center of Dasmarinas' ambitions was the effective conquest of the East Indies and the extension of Spanish power and his own rule through the Moluccas. With this end in view, for 3 years he made preparations. For months the shores were lined with the yards of the shipbuilders, and the great forests of Bulacan fell before the axes of the Indians. More than 200 vessels, galeras, calcotas, and virayas were built and assembled at Cavite. In the fall of 1593, the expedition, consisting of over 900 Spaniards, Filipino bowmen and rowers, was ready. Many of the Filipinos procured to row these boats were said to have been slaves, purchased through the Indian chiefs by the Spanish encomenderos. The governor sent forward this great fleet under the command of his son, Don Luis, and in the month of October he himself set sail in a galley with Chinese rowers. But on the night of the 2nd day, while off the island of Maricaban, the Chinese oarsmen rose against the Spaniards, of whom there were about 40 on the ship, and killed almost the entire number, including the governor. They then escaped in the boat to the Ilocos coast and thence to China. The murder of this active and illustrious general was a decisive blow to the ambitious projects for the conquest of the East Indies. Among other papers which Dasmarinas brought from Spain was a royal cedula giving him power to nominate his successor, who proved to be his son Don Luis, who after some difficulty succeeded temporarily to his father's position. Arrival of Morga. In June 1595 there arrived Don Antonio de Morga, who had been appointed lieutenant governor with judicial powers in cases of appeal. With Morga came several Jesuit missionaries. He was also the bearer of an order granting to the Jesuits the exclusive privilege of conducting missions in China and Japan. The other orders were forbidden to pass outside the islands. An attempt to colonize Mindanao. In the year 1596, the Captain Rodriguez de Figueroa received the title of Governor of Mindanao, with exclusive right to colonize the island for the space of 2 lives. He left Iloilo in April with 214 Spaniards, 2 Jesuit priests, and many natives. They landed in the Rio Grande of Mindanao, where the defiant dato, Silonga, fortified himself and resisted them. Almost immediately, Figueroa rashly ventured on shore and was killed by Moros. Reinforcements were sent under Don Juan Ronquillo, who, after nearly bringing the datos to submission, abandoned all he had gained. The Spaniards burned their forts on the Rio Grande and retired to Caldera, near Zamboanga, where they built a presidio. Death of Franciscans in Japan. The new governor, Don Francisco Teo de Guzman, arrived on June 1st, 1596. He had previously been treasurer of the Casa de Contratacion in Seville. Soon after his arrival, an important and serious tragedy occurred in Japan. The ship for Acapulco went ashore on the Japanese coast, and its rich cargo was seized by the feudal prince where the vessel sought assistance. The Franciscans already had missions in these islands, and a quarrel existed between them and the Portuguese Jesuits over this missionary field. The latter succeeded in prejudicing the Japanese court against their rivals, and when the Franciscans injudiciously pressed for the return of the property of the wrecked galleon, the feudal ruler, greedy for the rich plunder and exasperated by their preaching, met their petitions with the sentence of death. They were horribly crucified at the port of Nagasaki, February 5th, 1597. This feudal lord was the proud and mighty Hideyoshi. He was planning the conquest of the Philippines themselves, when death ended his plans. The first Archbishop in the Philippines. Meanwhile, the efforts of Salazar at the Spanish court had effected further important changes for the islands. The re-establishment of the Royal Audiencia was ordered, and his own position was elevated to that of Archbishop, with the three episcopal sects of Ilocos, Cebu, and the Camarines. He did not live to assume this office, and the first Archbishop of the Philippines was Ignacio Santibanez, who also died 3 months after his arrival, on May 28, 1598. Re-establishment of the Audiencia. The Audiencia was re-established with great pomp and ceremony. The royal seal was borne on a magnificently caparisoned horse to the cathedral, where a Te Deum was chanted, and then to the Casas Reales, where was inaugurated the famous court that continued without interruption down to the end of Spanish rule. Dr. Morga was one of the first oidores, and the earliest judicial record which can now be found in the archives of this court is the sentence bearing his signature. The rise of Moro piracy. The last years of de Guzman's governorship were filled with troubles ominous for the future of the islands. The presidio of Caldera was destroyed by the Moros. Following this victory, in the year 1599, the Moros of Jolo and Maguindanao equipped a piratical fleet of 50 caracoas and swept the coasts of the Bisayas. Cebu, Negros, and Panay were ravaged, their towns burned, and their inhabitants carried off as slaves. The following year saw the return of a larger and still more dreadful expedition. The people of Panay abandoned their towns and fled into the mountains, under the belief that these terrible attacks had been inspired by the Spaniards. To check these pirates, Juan Gallinato, with a force of 200 Spaniards, was sent against Jolo, but, like so many expeditions that followed his, he accomplished nothing. The inability of the Spaniards was now revealed, and the era of Moro piracy had begun. From this time until the present day, about the year 1800, wrote Zuniga, "These Moros have not ceased to infest our colonies. Innumerable are the Indians they have captured, the towns they have looted, the rancherias they have destroyed, the vessels they have taken. It seems as if God has preserved them for vengeance on the Spaniards that they have not been able to subject them in 200 years, in spite of the expeditions sent against them, the armaments sent almost every year to pursue them. In a very little while we conquered all the islands of the Philippines, but the little island of Jolo, a part of Mindanao, and other islands near by, we have not been able to subjugate to this day." Battle at Mariveles with the Dutch. In October 1600, 2 Dutch vessels appeared in the islands. It was the famous expedition of the Dutch admiral Van Noort. They had come through the Straits of Magellan on a voyage around the world. The Dutch were in great need of provisions. As they were in their great enemy's colony, they captured and sunk several boats, Spanish and Chinese, bound for Manila with rice, poultry, palm wine, and other stores of food. At Mariveles, a Japanese vessel from Japan was overhauled. Meanwhile, in Manila, great excitement and activity prevailed. The Spaniards fitted up 2 galleons and the oidor Morga himself took command with a large crew of fighting men. On December 14th they attacked the Dutch, whose crews had been reduced to no more than 80 men on both ships. The vessel commanded by Morga ran down the flagship of Van Noort, and for hours the ships lay side by side with a hand-to-hand fight raged on the deck and in the hold. The ships taking fire, Morga disengaged his ship, which was so badly shattered that it sank, with great loss of life, but Morga and some others reached the little island of Fortuna. Van Noort was able to extinguish the fire on his vessel and escape from the islands. He eventually reached Holland. His smaller vessel was captured with its crew of 13 men and 6 boys. The men were hanged at Cavite. Other troubles of the Spanish. In the year 1600, 2 ships sailed for Acapulco, but one went down off the Catanduanes and the other was wrecked on the Ladrones. On top of all other misfortunes, Manila suffered, in the last months of this government, a terrible earthquake, which destroyed many houses and the church of the Jesuits. The Moros, the Dutch, anxieties and losses by sea, the visitations of God. How much of the history of the 17th century in the Philippines is filled with these 4 things? End of chapter 7, part 2.
History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 8, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8. The Philippines 300 years ago. Condition of the archipelago at the beginning of the 17th century. The Spanish rule completely established. At the close of the 16th century, the Spaniards had been in possession of the Philippines for a generation. In these 35 years, the most striking of all the results of the long period of Spanish occupation were accomplished. The work of these first soldiers and missionaries established the limits and character of Spanish rule as it was to remain for 250 years. Into this first third of a century, the Spaniard crowded all his early feats of arms and exploration. Thereafter, down to 1850, few new fields were explored, but all through the 17th century, the missionaries were Christianizing the conquered peoples. The survey of the archipelago given by Morga, soon after 1600, reads like a narrative of approximately modern conditions. It reveals to us how great had been the activities of the early Spaniard and how small the achievements of his countrymen after the 17th century began. All of the large islands, except Palawan and the Moro country, were, in that day, under encomiendas, their inhabitants paying tributes and for the most part ready to embrace the Catholic faith. The smaller groups and islets were almost as thoroughly exploited. Even of the little Catanduanes, lying off the Pacific coast of Luzon, Morga could say, quote, "They are well populated with natives, a good race, all encomiendas of Spaniards, with doctrine and churches, and an alcalde mayor, who does justice among them." End quote. The Babuyanes at the north of the archipelago were an exception. Quote, "They are not encommended, nor is tribute collected among them, nor are there Spaniards among them, because they are of little reason and politeness, and there have neither been Christians made among them, nor have they justices." End quote. In 1591, however, the Babuyanes had been given an encomienda to Esteban de la Serna and Francisco Castillo. They are put as having 2,000 inhabitants and 500 tributantes, but all unsubdued, todos alcaldos. On some islands, the hold of the Spaniards was more extensive in Morga's day than at a later time. Then, the island of Mindoro was regarded as important, and in the early years and decades of Spanish power, appears to have been populous along the coasts. Later, it was desolated by the Moro pirates, and long remained wild and almost uninhabited, except by a shifting population from the mainland of Luzon and of pirates from Sulu. The encomiendas. As we have already seen, one of the vessels that followed the expedition of Legazpi brought orders from the king that the island should be divided in encomiendas among those who had conquered and won them. Note 1. Relación de la Conquista de Luzon, 1572, page 15. On this instruction, Legazpi had given the Filipinos in encomienda to his captains and soldiers as fast as the conquest proceeded. We are fortunate to have a review of this encomiendas, made in 1591, about 20 years after the system was introduced into the islands. Note 2. Relación de las encomiendas existentes en Filipinas, Retana, Archivo de Bibliofilo Filipino, Volume 4. There were then 267 encomiendas in the Philippines, of which 31 were of the king, and the remainder of private persons. Population under the encomiendas. From the enumeration of these encomiendas, we learn that the most populous parts of the archipelago were La Laguna, with 24,000 tributantes and 97,000 inhabitants, and the Camarines, which included all the Bicol territory, and the Catanduanes, where there were 21,670 tributantes and a population of over 86,000. Vicinity of Manila and Tondo, which included Cavite and Marigondon, the south shore of the bay, and Pasig and Taguig, where were collected 9,410 tributes from a population estimated at about 30,000. In Ilocos were reported 17,130 tributes and 78,520 souls. The entire valley of the Cagayan had been divided among the soldiers of the command which had effected the conquest. In the list of encomiendas, a few can be recognized, such as Igig and Tuguegarao, but most of the names are not to be found on the maps of today. Most of the inhabitants were reported to be rebellious, alcaldos, and some were apparently the same wild tribes which still occupy all of this watershed, except the very banks of the river, but nonetheless had the Spaniards divided them off into repartimentos. One soldier had even taken as an encomienda the inhabitants of the upper waters of the river, a region which is called in the Relacion Pugao, with little doubt the habitat of the same Igorot tribe as the Ipugao, who still dwell in these mountains. The upper valley of the Magat, or Nueva Vizcaya, had not at this date been occupied and probably was not until the missions of the 18th century. The population among the Visayan Islands was quite surprisingly small, considering its present proportions. Masbate, for example, had but 1,600 souls. Burias, a like number. The whole central group, leaving out Panay, only 15,833 tributes, or about 35,000 souls. There was a single encomienda in Butuan, Mindanao, and another on the Caraga coast. There were 1,000 tributes collected in the encomienda of Cuyo, and 1,500 in Calamianes, which, says the Relacion, included Los Negrillos, probably the mixed Negrito population of northern Palawan. The entire population under encomiendas is set down as 166,903 tribute, or 667,612 souls. This Relacion is one of the earliest enumerations of the population of the Philippines. Barring the Igorots of northern Luzon and the Moros and other tribes of Mindanao, it is a fair estimate of the number of the Filipino people 300 years ago. It will be noticed that the numbers assigned to single encomenderas in the Philippines were large. In America, the number was limited. As early as 1512, King Ferdinand had forbidden any single person, of whatever rank or grade, to hold more than 300 Indians on one island. Note 1. Ordenanzas. La repartición de los indios de la Isla Española in Documentos Ineditos, Volume 1, page 236. But in the Philippines, 1,000 or 1,200 tributantes were frequently held by a single Spaniard. Condition of the Filipinos under the encomiendas. Frequent revolts. That the Filipinos on many of these islands bitterly resented their condition is evidenced by the frequent uprisings and rebellions. The encomenderos were often extortionate and cruel, and absolutely heedless of the restrictions and obligations imposed upon them by the laws of the Indies. Occasionally a new governor, under the first impulse of instructions from Mexico or Spain, did something to correct abuses. Revolts were almost continuous during the year 1583, and the condition of the natives very bad, many encomenderos regarding them and treating them almost as slaves, and keeping them at labor to the destruction of their own crops and the misery of their families. Governor Santiago de Vera reached the islands the following year and made a characteristic attempt to improve the system, which is thus related by Zuniga. Quote, "As soon as he had taken possession of the government, he studied to put into effect the orders which he brought from the king, to punish certain encomenderos who had abused the favor they had received in being given encomiendas, whereby he deposed Bartolome de Ledesma, encomendero of Abuyo, Leyte, and others of those most culpable, and punished the others in proportion to the offenses which they had committed, and which had been proven." In the following year of 1585, he sent Juan de Morones and Pablo de Lima, with a well-equipped squadron, to the Moluccas, which adventure was as unfortunate as those that had preceded it, and they returned to Manila without having been able to take the fortress of Ternate. The governor felt it very deeply that the expedition had failed, and wished to send another armada in accordance with the orders which the king had given him. But he could not execute this because the troops from New Spain did not arrive, and because the Indians, who lost no occasion which presented itself to shake off the yoke of the Spaniards. The Pampangos and many inhabitants of Manila confederated within the Moros of Borneo, who had come for trade, and plotted to enter the city by night, set it on fire, and in the confusion of the conflagration slay all the Spaniards. This conspiracy was discovered through an Indian woman, who was married to a Spanish soldier, and measures to meet the conspiracy were taken before the mine exploded, many being seized and suffering exemplary punishment. The islands of Samar, Ibabao, and Leyte were also in disturbance, and in the encomendero of Dagami, Pueblo of Leyte, was in peril of losing his life, because the Indians were incensed by his thievings in the collection of tribute, which was paid in wax, and which he compelled them to have weighed with a steel yard, which he had made double the legal amount, and wanted to kill him. They would have done so if he had not escaped into the mountains, and afterwards passed by a bangka to the island of Cebu. The governor sent Captain Lorenzo de la Mota to pacify these disturbances. He made some punishments, and with these everything quieted down." End quote. Note 1. Historia de Filipinas, page 157, et SQ, period. 3 years later, however, the natives of Leyte were again in revolt. In 1589, Cagayan rose and killed many Spaniards. The revolt seems to have spread from here to the town of Dingras, Ilocos, where the natives rose against the collectors of tribute, and slew 6 Spaniards of the pueblo of Fernandina. Note 2. Among other documents, which throw a most unfavorable light upon the condition of the Filipinos under the encomiendas, is a letter to the king from Domingo de Salazar, the first bishop of the Philippines, which describes the conditions about 1583. Zuniga, Historia de Filipinas, page 165. Effects of the Spanish government. The Spanish occupation had brought ruin and misery to some parts of the country. Salazar describes with bitterness the evil condition of the Filipinos. In the rich fields of Bulacan and Pampanga, great gangs of laborers had been impressed, felling the forests for the construction of the Spanish fleets and manning these fleets at the oars, on voyages which took them for 4 and 6 months from their homes. The governor, Don Gonzalo Ronquillo, had forced many Indians of Pampanga into the mines of Ilocos, taking them from the sowing of their rice. Many had died in the mines and the rest returned so enfeebled that they could not plant. Hunger and famine had descended upon Pampanga, and on the encomienda of Guido de la Bezares, over 1,000 had died from starvation. Note 1. Domingo de Salazar, Relación de las Cosas de las Filipinas, 1583, page 5. In Retana, Archive, Volume 3. The Tribute. The tribute was a source of abuse. Theoretically, the tax upon Indians was limited to the tributo, the sum of 8 reales, about $1, yearly from the heads of all families, payable either in gold or in produce of the district. But in fixing the prices of these commodities, there was much extortion, the encomenderos delaying the collection of the tribute until the season of scarcity, when prices were high, but insisting then on the same amount as at harvest time. The principal, who occupied the place of the former dato, or maharlika, like the gobernadorcillo of recent times, was responsible for the collecting of the tribute, and his lot seems to have been a hard one. Quote, "If they do not give as much as they ask, or do not pay for as many Indians as they say there are, they abuse the poor principal, or throw him into the pillory, cepo de cabeza, because all the encomenderos, when they go to make collections, take their pillories with them, and there they keep him and torment him until forced to give all they ask. They are even said to take the wife and daughter of the principal when he cannot be found. Many are the principales who have died under these torments, according to reports." End quote. Salazar further states that he has known natives to be sold into slavery in default of tribute. Neither did they impose upon adults alone, but, quote, "they collect tribute from infants, the aged and the slaves, and many do not marry because of the tribute, and others slay their children." End quote. Note 1. Relacion, pages 13 and 14. Scarcity of food. Salazar further charges that the alcaldes mayores, the alcaldes of provinces, 16 in number, were all corrupt, and though their salaries were small, they accumulated fortunes. For further enumeration of economic ills, Salazar detailed how prices had evilly increased. In the first years of Spanish occupation, food was abundant. There was no lack of rice, beans, chickens, pigs, venison, buffalo, fish, coconuts, bananas, and other fruits, wine and honey, and a little money bought much. 100 gantas, about 300 liters of rice, could then be bought for a toston, a Portuguese coin, worth about a half peso, 8 to 16 fowls for a like amount, a fat pig for from 4 to 6 reales. In the year of his writing, about 1583, products were scarce and prices exorbitant. Rice had doubled, chickens were worth a real, a good pig 6 to 8 pesos. Population had decreased and whole towns were deserted, their inhabitants having fled into the hills. General improvement under Spanish rule. This is one side of the picture. It probably is overdrawn by the bishop, who was jealous of the civil authority and who began the first of those continuous clashes between the church and political power in the Philippines. Doubtless, if we could see the whole character of Spanish rule in these decades, we should see that the actual condition of the Filipino had improved and its grade of culture had risen. No one can estimate the actual good that comes to a people in being brought under the powerful government, able to maintain peace and dispense justice. Taxation is sometimes grievous, corruption without excuse, but almost anything is better than anarchy. Before the coming of the Spaniards, it seems unquestionable that the Filipinos suffered greatly under two terrible grievances that inflict barbarous society. In the first place, warfare, with its murder, pillage, and destruction, not merely between tribe and tribe, but between town and town, such as even now prevails in the wild mountains of northern Luzon, among the primitive Malayan tribes. and in the second place, the weak and poor man was at the mercy of the strong and rich. The establishment of Spanish sovereignty had certainly mitigated, if it did not wholly remedy, these conditions. Quote, all of these provinces, end quote, Morga could write, quote, are pacified and are governed from Manila, having alcaldes mayores, corregidors, and lieutenants, each one of whom governs in his district or province and dispenses justice. The chieftains, principales, who formerly held the other natives in subjection, no longer have power over them in the manner which they tyrannically employed, which is not the least benefit these natives have received in escaping from such slavery. End quote. Note 1. Sucesos de las Filipinas, page 334. Old social order of the Filipinos but little disturbed. Some governors seem to have done their utmost to improve the condition of the people and to govern them well. Santiago de Vera, as we have seen, even went so far as to commission the worthy priest, Padre Juan de Plasencia, to investigate the customs and social organization of the Filipinos, and to prepare an account of their laws, that they might be more suitably governed. This brief code, for so it is, was distributed to alcaldes, judges, and encomenderos, with orders to patent their decisions in accordance with Filipinos' custom. Note 1. Las costumbres de los Tagalos en Filipinas según el Padre Plasencia, Madrid, 1892. In ordering local affairs, the Spaniards to some extent left the old social order of the Filipinos undisturbed. The several social classes were gradually suppressed, and at the head of each barrio, or small settlement, was appointed the head, or cabeza de barangay. As these barangays were grouped into pueblos, or towns, the former datos were appointed captains and gobernadorcillos. The payment of tribute. The tribute was introduced in 1570. Note 2. Blumentritt, Organización Comunale des Indigenes des Philippines, traduide l'Allemand par A. Hugot, 1881. It was supposed to be 8 reals or a peso of silver for each family. Children under 16 and adults over 60 were exempt. In 1590, the amount was raised to 10 reals. To this was added a real for the church, known as sanctorum, and, on the organization of the towns, a real for the caja de comunidad or municipal treasury. Under the encomiendas, the tribute was paid to the encomenderos, except on the royal encomiendas. But after several generations, as the encomiendas decreased in number, these collections went directly to the insular treasury. There was later, besides the tribute, a compulsory service of labor on roads, bridges, and public works, known as the corvée, a feudal term, or perhaps more generally as the polos y servicios. Those discharging this enforced labor were called polistas. Conversion of the Filipinos to Christianity. The population was being very rapidly Christianized. All accounts agree that almost no difficulty was encountered in baptizing the more advanced tribes. Quote, there is not in these islands a province, end quote, says Morga, quote, which resists conversion and does not desire it, end quote. Note 1. Sucesos de las Filipinas, page 332. Indeed, the islands seem to have been ripe for the preaching of a higher faith, either Christian or Mohammedan. For a time, these two great religions struggled together in the vicinity of Manila. Note 2. See Salazar's relation on this point. But at the end of 3 decades, Spanish power and religion were alike established. Conversion was delayed ordinarily only by the lack of sufficient numbers of priests. We have seen that this conversion of the people was the work of the missionary friars. In 1591, there were 140 in the islands, but the Relación de las Encomiendas called for 160 more to properly supply the peoples which had been laid under tribute. Coming of the missionaries. The Augustinians had been the pioneer order, a few accompanying Legazpi. The first company of the Franciscans arrived in 1577. The first Jesuits, Padres Antonio Cedeño and Alonso Sanchez, had come with the bishop of the islands, Domingo de Salazar, in 1581. They came apparently without resources. Even their garments, brought from Mexico, had rotted on the voyage. They found a little poor narrow house in a suburb of Manila, called Lagyo, probably Concepcion. Quote, "So poorly furnished was it," unquote, says Chirino, quote, "that the same chest which held their books was the table on which they ate. Their food for many days was rice, cooked in water, without salt, or oil, or fish, or meat, or even an egg, or anything else except that sometimes as a regalo they enjoyed some salt sardines." End quote. Note 1. Chirino. Relacion. Pages 19 and 20. Dominicans came in 1587, and finally in 1606 the Recollects, or unshod Augustinians. Before the end of the century there were over 400. Division of the archipelago among the religious orders. The archipelago was districted among these missionary bands. The Augustinians had many parishes in the Visayas, on the Ilocano coast, some in Pangasinan, and all of those in Pampanga. The Dominicans had parts of Pangasinan and all of the valley of Cagayan. The Franciscans controlled the Camarines and nearly all of southern Luzon, and the region of Laguna de Bay. All of these orders had convents and monasteries both in the city of Manila and in the country round about. The imposing churches of brick and stone, which now characterize nearly every pueblo, had not in those early decades been erected, but Morga tells us that, quote, "the churches and monasteries were of wood, and well built, with furniture and beautiful ornaments, complete service, crosses, candlesticks, and chalices of silver and gold." End quote. Note 2. Morga. Page 329. The first schools. Even in these early years, there seem to have been some attempts at the education of the natives. The friars had schools in reading and writing for boys, who were also taught to serve in the church, to sing, to play the organ, the harp, guitar, and other instruments. We must remember, however, that the Filipino before the arrival of the Spaniard had a written language, and even in pre-Spanish times there must have been instruction given to the child. The type of humble school that is found today in remote barrios, conducted by an old man or woman, on the floor or in the yard of a home, where the ordinary family occupations are proceeding, probably does not owe its origin to the Spaniards, but dates from a period before their arrival. The higher education established by the Spaniards appears to have been exclusively for the children of the Spaniards. In 1601, the Jesuits, pioneers of the Roman Catholic orders in education, established the College of San Jose. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Recording by Hilary Hoven. 8, Part 2 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Establishment of hospitals. The city early had notable foundations of charity. The high mortality which visited the Spaniards in these islands and the frequency of diseases early called for the establishment of institutions for the orphan and the invalid. In Morga's time, there were the orphanages of San Andres and Santa Potenciana. There was a royal hospital, in charge of 3 Franciscans, which burned in the conflagration of 1603, but was reconstructed. There was also a hospital of Mercy, in charge of Sisters of Charity from Lisbon and the Portuguese possessions of India. Close by, the monastery of St. Francis stood then, where it stands today, the hospital for natives, San Juan de Dios. It was of royal patronage, but founded by a friar of the Franciscan order, Juan Clemente. Quote, "Here," end quote, says Morga, quote, "are cured a great number of natives of all kinds of sicknesses, with much charity and care. It has a good house and offices of stone, and is administered by the barefooted religious of St. Francis. 3 priests are there, and 4 lay brethren of exemplary life, who, with the doctors, surgeons, and apothecaries, are so dexterous and skilled that they work with their hands marvelous cures, both in medicine and surgery." Note 1. Sucesos de las Filipinas, page 323. Mortality among the Spaniards. Mortality in the Philippines in these years of conquest was frightfully high. The waste of life in her colonial adventures, indeed, drained Spain of her best and most vigorous manhood. In the famous Old English collection of voyages, published by Hakluyt in 1598, there is printed a captured Spanish letter of the famous sea captain Sebastian Vizcaino on the Philippine trade. Vizcaino grieves over the loss of life which had accompanied the conquest of the Philippines and the treacherous climate of the tropics. Quote, "The country is very unwholesome for us Spaniards, for within these 20 years, of 14,000 which have gone to the Philippines, there are 13,000 of them dead, and not past 1,000 of them left alive." End quote. Note 1. The principal navigations, voyages, traffics and discoveries of the English nation, by Richard Hakluyt, Master of Arts and sometime student of Christ Church in Oxford. Imprinted at London, 1598. Volume 1, page 560. The Spanish population. The Spanish population of the islands was always small. At the beginning of the 17th century, certainly not more than 2,000, and probably less later in the century. Morga divides them into 5 classes: the prelates and the ecclesiastics, the encomienderos, colonizers and conquerors, soldiers and officers of war and marine, merchants and men of business, and the officers of His Majesty's government. Quote, "Very few are living now," end quote, he says, quote, "of those first conquistadores who won the land and effected the conquest with the adelantado Miguel Lopez de Legazpi." End quote. Note 2. Sucesos de las Filipinas, page 347. The largest cities. Most of the Spanish population dwelt in Manila or in the 5 other cities which the Spaniards had founded in the first 3 decades of their occupation. These were as follows. The city of Nueva Segovia, at the mouth of the Cagayan, was founded in the governorship of Ronquillo, when the valley of the Cagayan was first occupied and the Japanese colonists who had settled there were expelled. It had at the beginning of the 17th century 200 Spaniards living in houses of wood. There was a fort of stone where some artillery was mounted. Besides the 200 Spanish inhabitants, there were 100 regular Spanish soldiers, with their officers and the alcalde mayor of the province. Nueva Segovia was also the seat of a bishopric which included all northern Luzon. The importance of the then promising city has long ago disappeared, and the pueblo of Laloc, which marks its site, is an insignificant native town. The city of Nueva Cucheres, in the Camarines, was founded by Governor Sande. It, too, was the seat of a bishopric, and had 100 Spanish inhabitants. The cities of Cebu and Iloilo, in the Visayas, were the cities of the Holy Name of God, Cebu, and on the island of Panay, Arevalo, or Iloilo. The first maintained something of the importance attaching to the first Spanish settlement. It had its stone fort and was also the seat of a bishopric. It was visited by trading vessels from the Moluccas, and by permit of the king enjoyed for a time the unusual privilege of sending annually a ship loaded with merchandise to New Spain. Arevalo had about 80 Spanish inhabitants and a monastery of the Augustinians. The city of Fernandina, or Bigan, which Salcedo had founded, was nearly without Spanish inhabitants. Still, it was a political center of the great Ilocano coast, and it has held this position to the present day. Manila. But all of these cities were far surpassed in importance by the capital on the banks of the Pasig. The wisdom of Legazpi's choice had been more than justified. Manila, at the beginning of the 17th century, was unquestionably the most important European city of the East. As we have already seen, in 1580, Portugal had been annexed by Spain, and with her had come all the Portuguese possessions in India, China, and Malaysia. After 1610, the Dutch were almost annually warring for this colonial empire, and Portugal regained her independence in 1640. But for the first few years of the 17th century, Manila was the political mistress of an empire that stretched from Goa to Formosa and embraced all those coveted lands which for a century and a half had been the desire of European states. The governor of the Philippines was almost an independent king. Nominally, he was subordinate to the Viceroy of Mexico, but practically he waged wars, concluded peaces, and received and sent embassies at his own discretion. The kingdom of Cambodia was his ally, and the states of China and Japan were his friends. The commercial importance of Manila. Manila was also the commercial center of the Far East and the entrepot through which the kingdoms of Eastern Asia exchanged their wares. Here came great fleets of junks from China laden with stores. Morga fills nearly 2 pages with an enumeration of their merchandise, which included all manner of silks, brocades, furniture, pearls and gems, fruits, nuts, tame buffalo, geese, horses, and mules, all kinds of animals, quote, even to birds in cages, some of which talk and others sing, and which they make perform 1,000 tricks. There are innumerable other gewgaws and knickknacks, which among Spaniards are in much esteem. End quote. Note 1. Successos de las Filipinas, page 352. Each year, a fleet of 30 to 40 vessels sailed with the new moon in March. The voyage across the China Sea, rough with the monsoons, occupied 15 to 20 days, and the fleet returned at the end of May or the beginning of June. Between October and March there came, each year, Japanese ships from Nagasaki, which brought wheat, silks, objects of art, and weapons, and took away from Manila the raw silk of China, gold, deer horns, woods, honey, wax, palm wine, and wine of Castile. From Malacca and India came fleets of the Portuguese subjects of Spain, with spices, slaves, Negroes and Kaffirs, and the rich production of Bengal, India, Persia, and Turkey. From Borneo, too, came the smaller craft of the Malays, who from their boats sold the fine palm mats, the best of which still come from Cagayan de Sulu and Borneo, slaves, sago, water pots, and glazed earthenware, black and fine. From Siam and Cambodia also, but less often, there came trading ships. Manila was thus a great emporium for all the countries of the East, the trade of which seems to have been conducted largely by and through the merchants of Manila. Trade with Mexico and Spain restricted. The commerce between the Philippines and Mexico and Spain, though it was of vast importance, was limited by action of the crown. It was a commerce which apparently admitted of infinite expansion, but the short-sighted merchants and manufacturers of the peninsula clamored against its development, and it was subjected to the severest limitations. 4 galleons were at first maintained for this trade, which were dispatched 2 at a time in successive years from Manila to the port of Acapulco, Mexico. The letter on the Philippine trade, already quoted, stated these galleons were great ships of 600 and 800 tons apiece. Note 1. Laws of the Indies, 8th, 45-46. They went, quote, very strong with soldiers, end quote, and they carried the annual mail, reinforcements, and supplies of Mexican silver for trade with China, which has remained the commercial currency of the East to the present day. Later, the number of galleons was reduced to 1. The rich cargoes of the galleons. The track of the Philippine galleon lay from Luzon northeastward to about the 42nd degree of latitude, where the westerly winds prevail, thence nearly straight across the ocean to Cape Mendocino in northern California, which was discovered and mapped by Vizcaino in 1602. Thence, the course lay down the western coast of North America, nearly 3,000 miles to the port of Acapulco. We can imagine how carefully selected and rich in quality were the merchandises with which these solitary galleons were freighted, the pick of all the rich stores which came to Manila. The profits were enormous, 600 and 800%. Vizcaino wrote that with 200 ducats invested in Spanish wares and some Flemish commodities, he made 1,400 ducats. But, he added, in 1588 he lost a ship, robbed and burned by Englishmen. On the safe arrival of these ships depended how much the fortunes of the colony. Capture of the galleons. For generations, these galleons were probably the most tempting and romantic prize that ever aroused the cupidity of privateer. The first to profit by this rich booty was Thomas Cavendish, who in 1587 came through the Straits of Magellan with a fleet of 3 vessels. Like Drake before him, he ravaged the coast of South America and then steered straightaway across the sea to the Moluccas. Here he acquired information about the rich commerce of the Philippines and of the yearly voyage of the galleon. Back across the Pacific went the fleet of Cavendish for the coast of California. In his own narrative, he tells how he beat up and down between Cape San Lucas and Mendocino until the galleon, heavy with her riches, appeared. She fell into his hands almost without a fray. She carried 122,000 pesos of gold and a great and rich store of satins, damask, and musk. Cavendish landed the Spanish on the California coast, burned the Santa Ana, and then returned to the Philippines and made an attack upon the shipyard of Iloilo, but was repulsed. He sent a letter to the governor at Manila, boasting of his capture, and then sailed for the Cape of Good Hope and home. There is an old story that tells how his sea-worn ships came up the Thames, their masts hung with silk and damask sails. From this time on, the venture was less safe. In 1588 there came to Spain the overwhelming disaster of her history, the destruction of the Great Armada. From this date her power was gone, and her name was no longer a terror on the seas. English freebooters controlled the oceans, and in 1610 the Dutch appeared in the east, never to withdraw. The city of Manila 300 years ago. We can hardly close this chapter without some further reference to the city of Manila as it appeared 300 years ago. Morga has fortunately left us a detailed description from which the following points in the main are drawn. As we have already seen, Legazpi had laid out the city on the blackened sites of the town and fortress of the Mohammedan prince, which had been destroyed in the struggle for occupation. He gave it the same extent and dimensions that it possesses today. Like other colonial capitals in the Far East, it was primarily a citadel and refuge from attack. On the point between the sea and the river, Legazpi had begun the famous and permanent fortress of Santiago. In the time of the great Adelantado, it was probably only a wooden stockade, but under the governor Santiago de Vera, it was built up of stone. Cavendish, 1587, describes Manila as, quote, an unwalled town and of no great strength, end quote. But under the improvements and completions made by Dasmarinas about 1590, it assumed much of its present appearance. Its guns thoroughly commanded the entrance to the river Pasig and made the approach of hostile boats from the harbor side impossible. It is noteworthy, then, that all the assaults that have been made upon the city, from that of Limahong to those of the British in 1762 and of the Americans in 1898, have been directed against the southern wall by an advance from Malate. Dasmarinas also enclosed the city with a stone wall, the base from which the present noble rampart has arisen. It had originally a width of from 7½ to 9 feet. Of its height no figure is given. Morga says simply that with its buttresses and turrets it was sufficiently high for the purposes of defense. The Old Fort. There was a stone fort on the south side facing Ermita, known as the Fortress of Our Lady of Guidance, and there were 2 or more bastions, each with 6 pieces of artillery. St. Andrew's, now a power magazine at the southeast corner, and St. Gabriel's, overlooking the Parian district where the Chinese were settled. The 3 principal gates to the city, with the smaller wickets and posterns, which opened on the river and sea, were regularly closed at night by the guard which made the rounds. At each gate and wicket was a permanent post of soldiers and artillerists. The Plaza de Armas, adjacent to the fort, had its arsenal, stores, powder works, and a foundry for the casting of guns and artillery. The foundry, when established by Ronquillo, was in charge of a Pampangan Indian called Pandapira. The Spanish buildings of the city. The buildings of the city, especially the Casas Reales and the churches and monasteries, had been durably erected of stone. Chirino claims that the hewing of stone, the burning of lime, and the training of native and Chinese artisans for this building was the work of the Jesuit father Cedeño. He himself fashioned the first clay tiles and built the first stone house, and so urged and encouraged others, himself directing the building of public works, that the city, which a little before had been solely of timber and cane, had become one of the best constructed and most beautiful in the Indies. Note 1. Relación de las Islas Filipinas, Chapter 5, page 23, and Chapter 13, page 47. He it was also who sought out Chinese painters and decorators and ornamented the churches with images and paintings. Within the walls, there were some 600 houses of a private nature, most of them built of stone and tile, and an equal number outside in the suburbs, or arrabales, all occupied by Spaniards. Todos son vivienda y población de los españoles. Note 2. Morga. Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, page 223. This gives some 1,200 Spanish families or establishments, exclusive of the religious, who in Manila numbered at least 150. Note 3. Ibid. Page 321. The garrison, at certain times, about 400 trained Spanish soldiers,
who had seen service in Holland and the Low Countries, and the official classes, the Malecon and the Luneta. It is interesting at this early date to find mention of the famous recreation drive, the Paseo de Bagumbayan, now commonly known as the Malecon and Luneta. Quote, Manila, end quote, says our historian, quote, has two places of recreation on land. The one, which is clean and wide, extends from the point called Our Lady of Guidance for about a league along the sea, and through the street and village of natives, called Bagumbayan, to a very devout hermitage, ermita, called the Hermitage of Our Lady of Guidance, and from there a good distance to a monastery and mission, doctrina, of the Augustinians, called Mahalat, Malate. End quote. Note 1, Morga, Sucesos, page 324. The other drive lay out through the present suburb of Concepcion, then called Lagyo, to Paco, where was the monastery of the Franciscans. The Chinese in Manila. Early Chinese commerce. We have seen that even as long as 300 years, Manila was a metropolis of the eastern world. Vessels from many lands dropped anchor at the mouth of the Pasig, and their merchants set up their booths within her markets. Slaves from far distant India and Africa were sold under her walls. Surely it was a cosmopolitan population that the shifting monsoons carried to and from her gates. But of all these eastern races, only one has been a constant and important factor in the life of the islands. This is the Chinese. It does not appear that they settled in the country or materially affected the life of the Filipinos until the establishment of Manila by the Spaniards. The Spaniards were early desirous of cultivating friendly relations with the Empire of China. Salcedo, on his first punitive expedition to Mindoro, had found the Chinese junk, which had gone ashore on the western coast. He was careful to rescue these voyagers and return them to their own land with a friendly message inviting trading relations. Commerce and immigration followed immediately the founding of the city. The Chinese are without question the most remarkable colonizers in the world. They seem able to thrive in any climate. They readily marry with every race. The children that follow such unions are not only numerous but healthy and intelligent. The coasts of China teem with overcrowding populations. Emigration to almost any land means improvement of the Chinese of poor birth. These qualities and conditions, with their keen sense for trade and their indifference to physical hardship and danger, make the Chinese almost a dominant factor wherever political barriers have not been raised against their entrance. The Chinese had early gained an important place in the commercial and industrial life of Manila. A letter to the king from Bishop Salazar shows that he befriended them and was warm in their praise. Note 1. Carta Relación de las Cosas de la China y de los Chinos del Parian de Manila, 1590, in Retana, Archivo, Volume 3. This was in 1590, and there were then in Manila and Tondo about 7,000 resident Chinese, and they were indispensable to the prosperity of the city. Importance of Chinese labor and trade. In the early decades of Spanish rule, the Philippines were poor in resources, and the population was sparse, quite insufficient for the purposes of the Spanish colonizers. Thus, the early development of the colony was based upon Chinese labor and Chinese trade. As the early writers are fond of emphasizing, from China came not only the finished silks and costly wares, which in large part were destined for the trade to New Spain and Europe, but also cattle, horses and mares, foodstuffs, metals, fruits, and even ink and paper. Quote, and what is more, end quote, says Chirino, quote, from China come those who supply every sort of service, all dexterous, prompt, and cheap, from physicians and barbers to burden bearers and porters. They are the tailors and shoemakers, metal workers, silversmiths, sculptors, locksmiths, painters, masons, weavers, and finally every kind of servitors in the Commonwealth. End quote. Note 1. Relación de las Islas Filipinas, page 18. See also Salazar, Carta Relación. Distrust of the Chinese. In those days, not only were the Chinese artisans and traders, but they were also farmers and fishermen, occupations in which they are now not often seen. But in spite of their economic necessity, the Chinese were always looked upon with disfavor and their presence with dread. Plots of murder and insurrection were supposedly rife among them. Writers object that their numbers were so great that there was no security in the land. Their life was bad and vicious. Through intercourse with them the natives advanced but little in Christianity and customs. They were such terrible eaters that they made food scarce and prices high. If permitted, they went everywhere through the islands and committed 1,000 abuses and offenses. They explored every spot, river, estero, and harbor, and knew the country better even than the Spaniard himself, so that if any enemy should come, they would be able to cause infinite mischief. Note 2. Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, page 364. When we find so just and high-minded a man as the president of the Audiencia, Morga, giving voice to such charges, we may be sure that the feeling was deep and terrible, and practically universal among all Spanish inhabitants. The first massacre of the Chinese. Each race feared and suspected the other, and from this mutual cowardice came in 1603 a cruel outbreak and massacre. 3 Chinese mandarins arrived in that year, stating that they had been sent by the emperor to investigate a report that there was a mountain in Cavite of solid precious metal. This myth was no more absurd than many pursued by the Spaniards themselves in their early conquests, and it doubtless arose from the fact that Chinese wares were largely purchased by Mexican bullion. But the Spaniards were at once filled with suspicion of an invasion, and their distrust turned against the Chinese in the islands. How far these latter were actually plotting sedition, and how far they were driven into attack by their fears at the conduct of the Spaniards, can hardly be decided. But the fact is that on the evening of St. Francis Day, the Chinese of the Parian rose. The dragon banners were raised, war gongs were beaten, and that night the pueblos of Quiapo and Tondo were burned and many Filipinos murdered. In the morning, a force of 130 Spaniards, under Don Luis Dasmarinas and Don Tomas Bravo, were sent across the river, and in the fight nearly every Spaniard was slain. The Chinese then assaulted the city, but according to the tradition of the priests, they were driven back in terror by the apparition of St. Francis on the walls. They threw up forts on the site of the Parian and in Dilao, but the power of their wild fury was gone, and the Spaniards were able to dislodge and drive them into the country about San Pablo del Monte. From here, they were dispersed with great slaughter. 23,000 Chinese are reported by Zuniga to have perished in this sedition. If his report is true, the number of Chinese in the islands must have increased very rapidly between 1590 and 1603. Restriction of Chinese immigration and travel. Commerce and immigration began again almost immediately. The number of Chinese, however, allowed to remain was reduced. The Chinese ships that came annually to trade were obliged to take back with them the crews and passengers which they brought. Only a limited number of merchants and artisans were permitted to live in the islands. They were confined to 3 districts in the city of Manila, and to the great market, the Alcaiceria or Parian. The word Parian was first used for the Chinese quarter adjoining the walled city on the present site of the Botanical Garden, but about 1640 the new Parian was built in Binondo, about the present Calle San Fernando. It consisted of a block of stores in the form of a square, with small habitations above them. Here was the great market of Manila. They could not travel about the islands, nor go 2 leagues from the city without a written license, nor remain overnight within the city after the gates were closed, on penalty of their lives. They had their own alcalde and judge, a tribunal and jail, and on the north side of the river Dominican friars, who had learned the Chinese language, had erected a mission and hospital. There was a separate barrio for the baptized Chinese and their families, to the number of about 500. The Chinese in the Philippines from the earliest time to the present have been known by the name of Sangleyes. The derivation of this curious word is uncertain, but Navarrete, who must have understood Chinese well, says that the word arose from a misapprehension of the words spoken by the Chinese who first presented themselves at Manila. Quote, being asked what they came for, they answered, Shanglei, that is, we come to trade. The Spaniards, who understood not their language, conceiving it to be the name of a country, and putting the 2 words together, made one of them, by which they still distinguish the Chinese, calling them Sangleyes. End quote. The Japanese colony. There was also in these early years quite a colony of Japanese. Their community lay between the Parian and the barrio of Laguio. There were about 500, and among them the Franciscans claimed a goodly number of converts. The Filipino district of Tondo. We have described at some length the cities south of the river and the surrounding suburbs, most of them known by the names they hold today. North of the Pasig was the great district of Tondo, the center of that strong, independent Filipino feeling which at an early date was colored with Mohammedanism and to this day is strong in local feeling. This region is thriven and built up until it has long been by far the most important and populous part of the metropolis, but not until very recent times was it regarded as a part of the city of Manila, which name is reserved for the walled city alone. A bridge across the Pasig, on the site of the present Puente de España, connected the 2 districts at a date later than Morga's time. It was one of the first things noticed by Navarrete, who, without describing it well, says it was very fine. It was built during the governorship of Niño de Tabora, who died in 1632. Note 1. Zuniga, Historia de las Filipinas, page 252. Montero states that it was of stone and that this same bridge stood for more than 2 centuries, resisting the incessant traffic and the strength of floods. Note 2. Historia General de Filipinas, Volume 1, page 187. The decline of Manila during the next century. Such was Manila 35 and 40 years after its foundation. It was at the zenith of its importance, the capital of the eastern colonies, the mart of Asia, more splendid than Goa, more powerful than Malacca or Macao, more populous and far more securely held than Ternate and Tidor. Quote, "Truly," end quote, exclaimed Chirino, quote, "it is another Tyre, so magnified by Ezekiel," end quote. It owed its great place to the genius and daring of the men who founded it, to the freedom of action which it had up to this point enjoyed, and to its superlative situation. In the years that followed, we have to recount for the most part only the process of decline. Spain herself was fast on the wane. A few years later, and the English had almost driven her navies from the seas. The Portuguese had regained their independence and lost empire. The Dutch were in the east, harrying Portuguese and Spaniard alike and fast monopolizing the rich trade. The commerce and friendly relations with the Chinese, on which so much depended, were broken by massacre and reprisal, and, most terrible and piteous of all, the awful wrath and lust of the Malay pirates, for decade after decade, was to be visited upon the archipelago. The colonial policy of the motherland, selfish, short-sighted, and criminal, was soon to make its paralyzing influence felt upon trade and administration alike. These things were growing and taking place in the next period, which we have to consider, the years from 1600 to 1663. They left the Philippines despoiled and insignificant, for a whole succeeding century, a decadent colony and an exploited treasure. End of chapter 8, part 2. Recording by Hilary Joven.